Right, folks, hello. You asked me to do a quick pre-lecture on the gender of the gift. Here it is. I spent the back end of last week reading the first half of this book, which I think is the complicated half. It's the confusing half of the book, and the one that people have most trouble with. It's most difficult to see what to do with it. So I want to talk quite briefly about the first part of this book and the way that I think that it works. Now, my copy is quite battered. I was appalled to find on the title page that it says Will Rollason, LSE 2001, which means that I've been reading this book for 17 years and I don't have absolute control of what it's saying by any stretch of the imagination. So this is a bit quick and dirty. It's a way of reading it. It's a way of thinking about it. But you shouldn't take it as being gospel. Now, I think the key thing to understand about the first part, so the first half of the gender of the gift, is that it has a triangular shape. Right? There are three players involved in this book. So we have the idea of Melanesia, particularly ethnography of Melanesia. And it's important to recognise this is ethnography of Melanesia, not anthropology of Melanesia. Strathern is going to regard the anthropology of Melanesia and the ethnography of Melanesia as being slightly different. So the ethnography of Melanesia is she's going to take as facts about Melanesians. This is a placeholder for the people themselves. And then we've got anthropology, particularly the anthropology of Melanesia, but also anthropology more generally. And then we've got feminism, right? So we've got this kind of a structure going on, okay, a triangular structure. What Strathern is going to try and do is to work out what the relationships are between Melanesia, anthropology, and feminism. And what she's trying to do is to create space for new ideas, to create space for new thoughts about Melanesia, right? So where do we start? How do we think through these ideas? Well, the place that Strathern seems to start is with the contention that the comparative project of anthropology has failed in Melanesia. Okay, so that's the first problem we have. The relationship between anthropology and Melanesia is one essentially of failure. So why? What does this failure consist in? In what sense has anthropology failed? I think the argument, of course, as everywhere else in this book, is quite complex. But if we boil it down, I think we can say that anthropology has failed to grasp what makes Melanesian societies similar to one another and different to Western societies. And that this problem is essentially a problem of framing. It's about the way in which anthropology has approached Melanesia, what it thinks Melanesia is about, what it thinks is at stake in Melanesia. Right? And for Strathern, the key problem is the problem with the way that anthropologists have thought about society. They have, she argues, and remember that she's talking about anthropology prior to 1988, which is when this book comes out. She argues that anthropologists have framed the problem of Melanesia in terms of society, as though what's at stake in Melanesia is the integration of people into society. And what's problematic about Melanesian societies, especially societies of the highlands of Papua New Guinea, what's problematic about these societies is that it's not actually obvious that what people are interested in, or what is at stake, is the integration of individuals into groups, into wider social formations, into what we call society. How can we see that problem? Now, to go back to that triangle I drew, here it is. So the relationship between anthropology and Melanesia is a kind of relationship of failure. We're not grasping very well what kind of a phenomenon Melanesian social life is. That's probably a problem of framing. Now, we can see that problem of framing by comparing the way that anthropology and feminism approach their subject matter, Melanesia, or whatever else it is, right? So, when anthropology encounters feminism, we find a difference in the way in which the subject matter is being treated, right? anthropology takes the problem of Melanesian society to be about social cohesion. How individuals are bound up into social wholes of one kind or another, how they're made into the right kind of people to occupy a particular kind of social system. So at stake in anthropology is what that social system is, how does it work, how does it capture people, how does it make them part of itself. Feminism, Strathern argues, doesn't and can't take that view. For feminists, the problem of Melanesia is not the problem of how all people are integrated into society, but how women are oppressed in Melanesian societies. That means that feminists tend to take society for granted and to look into its effects, its political effects, its gendered effects of domination for women, not cohesion as such. Cohesion gets taken for granted. The question is, for whom is this cohesion? Now that's important because this relationship between anthropology and feminism is going to show us that a social framing, the sort of framing that anthropologists have brought to Melanesia, which is not working out, is not the only kind of framing that we can use, right? Even within the confines of our own thought, we can think anthropology differently. However, feminism is not the answer to the problem. Okay? It's not that we can simply shift from thinking anthropologically about Melanesia to thinking in feminist terms about Melanesia. And the reason for that is because we've seen that social control, social cohesion is not the issue in Melanesian societies. And that's an argument that Strathern makes, particularly around ritual. The rituals she wants to talk about happen mainly in the Eastern Highlands of Papua New Guinea. They're rituals associated with male cults, which have men's houses and initiate boys into the male cult. And the way they initiate boys into the male cult is typically by symbolically reproducing systems of or features of human reproduction. So they will bleed boys, which is often read as a replacement for menstruation. They will inseminate boys as a replacement for breastfeeding. And the symbolism looks as though it's replacing women or male-female relations of procreation with male-male relations, which produce men who are unambiguously male. And what Strathern argues is that that's not really what's going on, that there is no sense in which these cults are making men. What they're rather doing is remaking the relations between men and women. And at every phase, basically, what Strathern is saying is that you're looking at substances, you're looking at identities, you're saying this person is a man, and that prevents you from seeing the way in which this man relates to a woman. That becomes important later in what I'm going to say. It's worth being aware of now, right? So what these Eastern Highlands cults are doing is not making men, but remaking the relationships between men and women, or enabling people to see them in new ways. So that social framing in which men are, or boys are made into men, or pre-social individuals are made into socialised men, for Strathern is not what's at stake. So the anthropological account of what's happening in Melanesia doesn't work. But the account about gender domination also doesn't work in the way that feminists think it does. She makes this argument in a number of ways. An important way she makes it is in terms of domestic relations. Feminist anthropologists typically think of the domestic domain as being a domain of women in which productive activities take place, in which value is produced through subsistence agriculture, through the raising of pigs. Now, what happens in Melanesia is that men take the products of women's labour, particularly pigs, and they convert it into a male domain of prestige, right? They exchange pigs between men, which is the socially valued activity, which is what gives men a name as big people, as people who are famous. So what they're doing is they're converting, or the way that feminists read these relationships, is that they're converting women's labour into men's value, and that this is an exploitative relationship. Now, Strathern argues that that's not right. Again, the problem is that we're regarding the domestic domain as being about women and the public domain as being about men, and a transfer of value taking place between these two domains. But what Strathern argues and what she shows is that actually, even in the Highland societies where this kind of activity takes place, it's simply not the case that the domestic domain is a women's domain. Actually, people become properly human, they become properly social in the domestic domain. Right? It's actually a domain which is important for all kinds of people. It's where you show yourself to be a proper kinsman. It's where you show yourself to be a human being who's capable of having proper relationships with other people. It's not about women. When men, therefore, are extracting themselves from that domain, which they do when they engage in warfare, they're not dominating it, because everything that happens in that public domain of warfare and exchange actually depends completely on whatever's happening in this domestic domain. So what's at stake here is not gender domination of female domesticity by men, right? Something else is at stake. Some relationship between men and women is being modified, that's clear. What is at stake is gender, that's clear. But it's not a relationship of control, that's what she's arguing. Essentially, what's happening in this triangular formation that the gender of the gift has is we find that anthropology's account of Melanesia is about control of individuals by society. Feminists' account of Melanesia is about control of women by men. Those two accounts of control are not the same. One of them is about social cohesion, one of them is about gender domination, but neither of them are making a very good account of Melanesia. So what seems to be happening is that anthropology and feminism give different accounts of control. Melanesia, on the other hand, is not offering us an account which could be based on ideas of control. Whatever is at stake in Melanesia, it's not control, right, or power as control. Why does this happen? Why does this disjuncture between these two terms, anthropology and feminism, and this term here, Melanesia, why does this disjuncture happen? And this is the key part of Strathern's argument. I think it happens in chapter 6, or the bulk of the work happens in chapter 6. And what Strathern is going to argue is that this disjuncture between this bottom line of the triangle and the top one happens because Melanesian people are not formed. They don't think about themselves in the same way as Western people, as European or American people. And Strathern argues that Western people are formed on the basis of what she calls root metaphors of private property and commodity production. And here Strathern is leaning very heavily on Wagner's work. Wagner, as you'll recall, argues that in order to make meaning, in order to create meaning in social life, we have to extend metaphors to other things. That's how we talk about stuff, right? We have a metaphor, we have an image about something. We have, God, the Father, right, is an extension of a metaphor from kinship relations, my Father, to talk about God. Now, what Strathern is arguing is that in Western European thought, commodity relations, ideas about private property, are very, very, very central. When we talk about other stuff, we extend the imagery of private property and commodity production to think about other things, often without noticing it. So what she's going to try and do is to use Melanesia to make that extension of property relations apparent, right? And Melanesia can do that because anthropology and feminism are doing such a bad job of grasping what Melanesian social life is about, right? So how are European or Western individuals formed in terms of these root metaphors of private property and commodity production? It happens in a number of ways. But the idea of private property, which Strathern regards as being what she calls a one-to-one relationship between a person and an item, a thing exterior to themselves. And by one-to-one relation, she means that if something is my private property, it cannot be anybody else's property, right? Nobody else has any claims over it. It is my thing, right? So that idea gives us the notions of individuals, right? The individual as somebody who has a unitary identity, a one-to-one relationship with themselves, right? Who is never anybody else, who is self-possessed, literally, who owns their identity and owns their action. Right, so the notion of individuals, which is crucial to anthropology's notion of social cohesion, right, the way in which individuals who are self-owning entities are bound into a larger social life, is dependent on this notion of a person who has property in themselves, who is self-possessed and self-owning. So it gives us the relationship between individuals who are self-owning and societies which somehow bind those individuals into a system. It also gives us the idea of a society, right, through the idea of private property, and especially through the idea of commodities, right, commodities which are produced out of raw materials, out of something else, and made into something useful. Society seems to work in the same way as commodity production. It takes individuals and it reproduces them as social persons, right? So society also seems to be modelled on those relations of commodities and private properties. On the feminist side, it gives us the notion of exploitation. If we want to talk about, for example, Western Highlands men exploiting women, then we have to assume that individual people own the things that they do and the things that they make, right? So to see Western Highlands men, when they take pigs from women and transact them as exploiting women's labour, we have to assume that the pigs that women raise belong to them. And that assumption itself depends on notions of commodity production and private property. Marxist ones specifically, where what people produce is their product, or should be their product. So it gives us the notion of exploitation, and it also gives us the notion of the domestic as a female, sub-adult, sub-social domain. And the reason that the domestic seems like that is that in commodity economies, where you don't produce what you need in a domestic space, you go out of the domestic to work, to sell your labour, to make money, to produce things. Production in a commodity economy does not happen in domestic life. The only way that we can see the domestic as being a sub-adult, sub-social domain, which is dominated by men out there in the public domain, is by imagining that domestic life in Melanesia is somehow like domestic life in a money economy, in a commodity economy like the UK, where actually production is not happening in the domestic sphere, where the domestic sphere is in fact dependent on people going out beyond the domestic sphere, leaving home to get jobs so that they can send money back to their wives and children. So that whole conceit in the feminist anthropology about the exploitation of women and the production of a domestic sphere which is subordinate to men likewise depends on a modelling which is based on the commodity economy. As I said before, both of these perspectives, the anthropological and the feminist perspective, are based on the conceit that somehow or other social life is about control, right? Control of people by society, control of individuals by society, control of women by men. And that idea of control for Strathern also is predicated on property relations. If I have private property in something, I control it. I have the right to dispose of it. It is mine, right? That vision of power, right? An exclusive notion of power, where the power that I have over something or some person is power that that person therefore does not have, or that thing does not have, is predicated on ideas of private property, right? Where power is exclusive, it's a zero-sum game where I can control things. So if, for example, if men have power in social life, therefore women do not. If society has power over individuals, therefore individuals do not have power to do what they want, right? That exclusive notion of power. Strathern argues is modelled on property ownership. Now, there's a problem, of course, here. If we identify these features of Western European thought, how do we think outside of them, given that we exist in the Western European academy, right? This is the way thought is structured. This is the way that it happens. We can't just decide to think in different ways. It's hard to think in different ways. In fact, these ways of thought are so ingrained that even though anthropologists know exactly and have known since Moses' essay on the gift, that lots of people, most people probably, do not hold property in the way that we expect them to do. That often they have to be forced to hold property in this way, right? Even though we know that, our ideas of power and society and individuals and gender are still structured in those ways, right? It's difficult not to think in these terms. So how do we avoid falling into that trap and modelling all of our thinking after private property. Well, here Melanesia helps us, right? Because we know, first of all, that Melanesian people, on the whole, do not hold things in private ways as we hold things, as we hold property, right? Whereas private property is based on the notion that one piece of property has one owner. The way in which Melanesian people relate to things doesn't work in that way. Right? If I hold land, for example, I don't hold it privately. Other people have claims on the land that I use. If I have a canoe, right, I don't own that canoe myself. Even if I'm the person who controls the canoe, I'm the captain of the canoe, I'm the person who looks after it. I don't own it myself. Malinowski and the Trobrians shows us that. All of the people who helped to build the canoe have claims on it. Right? The people who cut the wood, who provided materials, who maybe gave money, who gave food, my wife, their wives, my in-laws, all of these people have claims on that canoe, so I don't own it myself. Right? That private property idiom in Melanesia doesn't work. Rather, we end up with an idiom which we recognise from Moses' essay on the gift, and particularly from Chris Gregory's re-theorisation of the gift in Gifts and Commodities, which has a big impact on the way that the gender of the gift works. And the way that Gregory theorizes the relationship between the commodity and the gift is something like this. So on the commodity side, we have items which are produced for sale, right, which are alienable. Right? Now, alienability is pretty much the same as private ownership. If I own something, right, I have a one-to-one relationship with it. If I sell that thing, my claim on it, right, ends. And if I sell my bike on eBay, I can no longer claim that bicycle in any way. It comes to belong to its next owner, whose ownership is private in the sense that it excludes any prior claims that I might have over it. It is not mine anymore. That's what alienability means, that you can really give something away. Commodities are produced for sale, which is to say that they are alienable. Because they're alienable, when I transact a commodity, any responsibilities or obligations that I might have end with that transaction when it's completed, right? So alienable commodities are transacted. This is the third point. So they're produced for sale, they're alienable, they're transacted by people in relations of mutual independence from one another. If I go and buy something in a shop, I don't have to know the person from whom I buy, because the transaction is set up in such a way, mainly through the agency of money, that I don't need to care who the person is that I'm buying from. You know? Gifts, by contrast, and Gregory sets up this contrast, are not produced for sale. Gifts, in fact, cannot be sold because they are inalienable. Right? A gift always has debt attached to it. It always has claims attached to it. If, for example, I give you my sister as your wife, she does not thereby cease to be my sister. Right? She becomes your wife as well, but my claim on her as my sister continues. Right? If I give you in Kula, for example, an arm shell, and I give this thing to you, you hold on to it, but its history of its association with me continues. Right? Gifts are not alienable. They are inalienable. Right? They continue to be bound into trains of obligation, even though they've been given away. As a result of that feature of gifting, gifts are exchanged by people in relations of mutual dependence. Right? I give you something, you owe it to me. When you give it back to me, I will owe it to you. Those transactions continue. They are not stopped in the way that a commodity transaction is stopped by my paying for something. It ends. So gifts seem to be the inversions of commodity relations, and they seem to be, theoretically, typical of Melanesian social life. Melanesian people give one another gifts all the time. And, this is important, gifts are actually internal to our thought. They're internal to social science. The theory of the gift is a social scientific theory of a gift. So within our knowledge, there seems to be an alternative to commodities as a way of framing social relations, right? So internal to Western social science, that possibility exists. Now, the strategy that Strathern is going to pursue in The Gender of the Gift, what she calls a creative fiction, is to deliberately use the anthropological theory of the gift to to grasp Melanesia and to critique feminism as a metaphor, as a new, different root metaphor for rendering visible commodity metaphors and displacing them, right? So she's deliberately and consciously seeking to displace the commodity as a way of thinking about Melanesia, as a way of giving Melanesia space to reveal itself to us, to enable us to create new knowledge, which is not either about social cohesion or about gender domination, but is about whatever it is that Melanesian people are concerned with. What's going to happen immediately that we expose ideas about individual and society to metaphors based on the gift is that we find that there are in fact no individuals. Right? If we thought to begin with that individuals were predicated on notions of private property and property holding, then if we rethink individuals in terms of the gift, then it turns out that those individuals are not actually individuals. What's important about them is not their one-to-one relation with themselves, their self-identity, but rather, like a gift, the trains of obligation in which they're bound up. So individuals is going to cease to appear to be these singular things which we can identify and might need to be bound into wider structures. They're going to appear as things which have sources, which have roots, and are already necessarily bound up into wider structures. It tells you, for example, why society and social cohesion is not what's at issue in Melanesia, right? People are composed already of social relations. Same goes for society, right? By the same token, society is going to vanish, right, as a problem. It's not saying it needs to be established. If you think about people in terms of gift relations, in terms of where they come from and how they're already related to other people, then it turns out that cohesion is not what's at issue. Actually, more likely what's at issue, as in Wagner, is separation, right? Getting people to be seen, getting people to be visible. That's what's going to happen when, for example, men transact pigs amongst themselves in the Western Highlands and create their prestige. Is they're not dominating anything, actually. They're not dominating women, and they're not being articulated from society. They're situationally separating themselves off from all of the other obligations that they have so that they can be seen as men transacting pigs and gaining prestige. That was exactly what they're doing. So the individual and society, if we think through social life in terms of gifts, is going to vanish. And we have to start thinking about the relations which always obtain between people, rather than how relations have to be built, and so how people get integrated into society. On the feminist side of things, exploitation is going to cease to be an issue. Right? Exploitation, remember, depends on the idea that people have a proprietary relationship with the things that they produce, or they should have that relationship. Now, two things happen if you start thinking about work in terms of gifts. First thing is, private property, as we've seen, evaporates, right? You can't have private property in a gift economy because things are always owed. They're produced in relations of dependence, right? Not independence. They're owned in relations of dependence. So if a man takes pigs from his wife in order to transact them with other men, it's because the woman already owed the man pigs, her husband. Right? She produces the pigs, not just for the hell of it, not so that they're hers. She produces the pigs because they're already owed to him. So he's maybe removing the pigs from her, but he's not exploiting her in quite the same way that he would be if we imagine those pigs as the woman's private property. Likewise, actually, in more general terms, the second thing that happens, labour as such, in the Marxist sense of things that people do, the stuff that they make, the work that they perform for a particular end, actually won't work in a gift economy, right? Labour can't be abstracted from the relationships in which it happens. We saw that in Papua New Guinea, typically domestic relations, the relations in which people become people, right? They demonstrate their interdependence with one another, their capacity to be kin. That happens because the work that they do, again, is always for somebody. The work itself can't be abstracted as a thing from the relationships in which it happens. If you can't abstract labour from relations, then it's enormously difficult to think about people being exploited. There was never a situation in which that labour was not going to be directed to the ends to which it's actually directed, to the people to which it's directed. So it's very, very hard to imagine people being exploited. By the same token, domination then, imagined in terms of gifts, right, is not going to be about control. Power is not going to be about control. Right? The notion that if I get power, I control you and you don't get power, right, is predicated on private property. There's power, I own it, So I have an exclusive relation with it. You don't own it, so you come under my control. If gifts are inalienable, right, I give you a gift, you hold it, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily not mine, right? I still have a claim on it because you've got to give it back. If we think power in those terms, it means that I momentarily have the power to do something. That does not mean that you do not also have the power to do things. So just like in a gift economy where debt alternates between people, you give me something, I receive something back again, our debts, what we owe one another goes back and forth between us, we're much more liable to see power as a situational alternation between people, where I have a capacity to do something right now, but my doing something is actually going to give you the capacity to do something, right? It's a relation that happens between people rather than something that one or another person holds. So power ceases to be a possession. We're not going to see domination in terms of control, but in terms of an exchange or alternation between people. So the question then, that's essentially then what happens in the first part of the gender of the gift, right? We start off with these relations between Melanesia, anthropology and feminism. We find that neither anthropology nor feminism deals with Melanesia very well. They both deal with Melanesia differently, right? So it's a question of framing, right? Anthropology deals with Melanesia in terms of society. Feminism deals with Melanesia in terms of gender domination. Neither of them work very well. It turns out that anthropology and feminism are both dealing with the same kinds of imageries in different ways, right? Luckily, though, they deal with the same kinds of imageries, namely private property and commodity production, in different ways. Because they're different, that shows us there is an escape route, right? We can think differently within the confines of social science. What's the most appropriate way to think about Melanesia from within our social science? Well, it looks like it's the idea of the gift, right? The gift is going to enable us to displace both the ways that anthropology and feminism are thinking about Melanesia. When we start doing that, it enables us, it gives us the resource to do anthropology differently. Right? That's where you get to at the end of the first part of the gender of the gift. You can do anthropology differently. You can do feminism differently. It has cost. You can't talk about social cohesion. You can't talk about gendered domination. But it's going to open the space within Western social science. That's really, really important. Within Western social science, it's going to open the space where we might be able to make a better description and a better account of what it is that Melanesians are doing. When we come to the lecture on Thursday, we're going to talk about where we go from there. Right? Where we go from there, what kind of substantive model can we establish to specify what it is that Melanesians are up to more generally? So I'll leave you with that, and I will see you on Thursday.